start. So we're all good, yeah? Lovely. So good morning, everybody. It's Matt Baird here. I know a number of you from the Social Housing Roundtable or for recruiting for a number of you. I've been involved in social housing recruitment now for 11 years. I'm also on the board for Spring Housing, where I last met Michael, actually, our guest speaker today, so good to see you again. And I'm the chair of the Supported Exempt Accommodation Forum, which is a forum based out of the Midlands in Birmingham, which is predominantly, at the moment, managing agents and relevant partners who are trying to change the system from the inside, really. Eden invited me to kind of co-chair these. This is our second event last year, and the idea was to bring people together who are all involved in the sector again to see whether or not collectively, A, we can share best practice, but B, we can really try and influence what the changes being made in the sector at the moment, because evidently we're in for a massive year of change. So Eden, I'll pass across to you to do your introductions, and then we'll bring Michael in.
Yes, hi everybody. Quite a few familiar faces here. So I'm Eden Bailey. I'm the head of housing services for HFT. So HFT is a national charity that provides supported housing. We got residential dom care for people with learning difficulties. So our geography is quite dispersed. I'm also the founder for the supported housing networking group. I'm currently a board member for Birmingham Civic Housing Association and also a trustee for Kairos Women Working Together. So they are a very small charity based in Coventry, and they support women suffering from like sexual exploitation. Thank you. Just want to plug as well that we now have a WhatsApp group for our supported housing networking group. So if any of you have not joined our WhatsApp group, please message me your mobile number. We'll add you to the supported housing WhatsApp group. Basically, it's just if you got quick question that want answered in real time, we'll be able to provide sort of advice at that point. Thank you.
And it's already proved to be very useful, hasn't it? I think there's already been a number of things answered and things like that, so it's been great. So Michael, I'll pass over to you, who's our guest speaker today, to introduce kind of what you're, I guess, going to be covering for the first kind of 15 minutes or so, and then we're 15-20 minutes before we have that wider open discussion. So brilliant to have you with us. Nice to see you again, but I'll pass over to you.
Pleasure. Good to see you too, Matt and Eden, and good morning to everyone else too. My name's Michael Patterson. I have to start off with a confession, which is that I've got form with this stuff, exempt accommodation and enhanced housing benefit, because as some of you may know, back in the halcyon days of supporting people, just as it was beginning to retrench in 2005, myself and a few other people identified this mysterious set of rules called the exempt accommodation rules that were the gateway to this other unheard of concept called enhanced housing benefit, which would come in dead handy at that time to offset some of the loss that providers were experiencing as a consequence of the retrenchment of supporting people funding. So back in 2005, there was an enhanced housing benefit budget of sort of zero. Fast forward 17 years, we got about £1 billion. And on the positive side, of course, if it weren't for enhanced housing benefit, what would we have to fund what we do? On the negative side, how come so many people have got their beak in the trough on this one? And what can we do about it? Well, the beaks in the trough situation has been one that's been growing exponentially over a number of years. And it's only recently become relatively recently become a local and national political issue. As a consequence, we've had exempt accommodation pilots, we've had the exempt accommodation inquiry and its report, which I want to speak to today. And we've also had the supported housing regulatory oversight bill. Now, I might take a bit longer than Matt said to get through this, forgive me. If anyone
That's okay.
Chip in. Now, when people talk about exempt accommodation, people always tend to talk about it in the negative. And I think it's important because I have a few negative things to say about the exempt accommodation inquiry report and the supported housing regulatory oversight bill. It's not all negative. but actually you should at least start with a positive proposition that visualises why doesn't this system work properly? How could it work properly, notwithstanding the fact that we have both the inquiry report and the Supported Housing Regulatory Oversight Bill. So firstly, what I wanted to do is describe what is exempt accommodation. Sorry if this is basic stuff to some people, but it's not always, because the reason I want to do this is because I think the debate and the conclusions of the debate are somewhat skewed by a misunderstanding about what exempt accommodation actually is. I want to identify what the problems are with exempt accommodation structurally. I want to put forward a simple, radical solution for change, which is a lot more straightforward than what's being discussed at the moment. I want to make the point as well that the debate around exempt accommodation, which has been framed about a lack of regulation, is the wrong framework. It's not about regulation. We've got, I can think of at least 4 regulators in the supported housing ecosystem. I'll name them later. I then want to go into detail about the exempt accommodation inquiry, followed up by the Supported Housing Regulatory Oversight Bill. So, by way of introduction, last few years we've seen an increasing disquiet over the wholesale abuse of enhanced housing benefit and the exempt accommodation rules. You all know Birmingham in particular is an outrider in this regard. 23,000 units of exempt accommodation, which they want to reduce down to, I think it's 9,000, or I heard 11, somewhere of that order. There have been a number of interrelated developments to try and deal with this situation. Firstly, what is, though, exempt accommodation? Without going into the detailed legalese, if we look at that 3rd bullet point, this is what typically, I mean, the bullet point above refers to resettlement units as they used to be known.
I can't see the presentation. I don't know whether or not Eden's sharing it or not.
Sorry, let me share the PowerPoint. I apologise.
Sorry, Mike. You said the 3rd bullet point, and I was just thinking I can't see the presentation, so I figured I'd just get that one up on the screen. I'm
privileged, the only one who can actually see the PowerPoint, and I've been staring at it for the last 3 days, I think, as well. Sorry, folks. So
what page are you on, Michael?
Keep going. Click 2. Yeah, next one. And next one. There we go. Right. So
lovely.
Thank you for that. So forget about the 1st bullet point. This 3rd bullet point here, a resettlement place, refers to what were known as DHS resettlement units years ago. But the primary paragraph for our purposes is exempt accommodation is provided by a non-metropolitan county council, a housing association as in a registered provider, a charity or a voluntary organisation, where that body or a person acting on its behalf also provides the claimant with care, support and supervision. Okay, so you have to be one of those organisations, where there's 4 organisational types. You have to own or lease the property. The people who live in it must have care, support and supervision needs, and those needs must be either met by the landlord or an agent on the landlord's behalf. That's exempt accommodation. The interesting thing about that, next slide please, is that it actually applies to the vast bulk of socially managed supported housing. And therein we have the problem, because when people think of exempt accommodation in the public domain, they tend to think of it as some kind of potentially dubious subsector of supported housing. It's been described as the exempt accommodation subsector. But actually, all the exempt accommodation that we're worried about has the same legal status as the vast bulk of the well-managed stuff that never gets referred to as exempt accommodation. It just gets referred to as supported housing, but actually it's exempt accommodation as well. The sort of mainstream supported housing that we all know and love, and no one would ever question the integrity of the organisations that deal with it. It's still exempt accommodation. Someone once told me that exempt accommodation is by definition non-commissioned. It's not. I mean, most supported housing is now non-commissioned, frankly, in terms of a financial contribution. But exempt accommodation is not by definition non-commissioned. The problem is you've had a lot of people coming in to take advantage of the exempt accommodation rules and setting up non-commissioned services. So people make the association between the two. These rules were devised back in the mid-90s to prevent the abuse of the housing benefit system by dodgy bed and breakfast providers who used to charge 500 quid a week for a broom cupboard and a third of a pint of milk in the morning. The rules are now being used. What those rules did was to restrict the entitlements of private sector landlords down to local housing allowance levels. That's what they did. But there were some landlords who were exempt from that restriction, hence exempt accommodation. These rules are now being used for the very opposite of what they were intended, which is to prevent abuse of the housing benefit system, because that's what they're being used to do. Next slide, please. Exempt accommodation is not a form of supported housing. Exempt accommodation rules are a gateway to enhanced housing benefit for those organisations that comply with the rules, or in current days, some of those that pretend to do so. And this confusion between exempt accommodation being supported housing and exempt accommodation being a set of rules is a problem. I had this discussion with Eddie Hughes, who was the Minister for Housing and Homelessness until recently, and said to him, we should abolish the exempt accommodation rules. His response is, we couldn't possibly close down all that accommodation. Well, we're not asking you to. That's supported housing. The exempt accommodation rules is what funds it, and the people who run it. That's what we need to abolish. They're no longer fit for purpose. They also create a three-tier system of tenancy entitlements. If you're the tenant of a registered provider and you have additional needs, you're likely going to be in receipt of full enhanced housing benefit. New slide, please. If you're the tenant of a charity, new slide, if we could. So if you're a tenant of a charity, a CIC, or a voluntary organisation, whilst you're theoretically entitled to enhanced housing benefit in the full amount, you're likely to get restricted because the local authority can't fully reclaim what's being paid to you by the subsidy rules. So you tend to get somewhere between LHA and full enhanced HB. If you are the tenant of a private supported housing provider, you're restricted to LHA because of the exempt accommodation rules. So we have a three-tier system of entitlements based on the legal identity of the tenant's landlord. I mean, that's bonkers. It's also discriminatory, because since when was private supported housing not supported housing? Problem is, it's not overseen, but I'll come back to that. Next slide, please. So the way that housing benefit, enhanced housing benefit, is administered at the moment is a transitional system. And this goes back to 2012, September 2012, Lord Freud, Minister for Welfare Reform, said, look, tenants in supported housing claiming universal credit should tick the box that says I'm in supported housing. What will happen then is the housing component of their universal credit will be administered as housing benefit under the exempt accommodation rules. So the only use of housing benefit left is that. So we've had this transitional arrangement whereby the housing component of universal credit is effectively uncapped, has been since its inception. So why don't we just formalise that system? We could establish at local level, and this is some of the things that the inquiry and the regulatory oversight bill state, we could have agreed maxima at local level for both core rent costs and eligible services costs in IHM, for example, provided, of course, they were reasonable maxima. And we could call that supported housing rent, and just simply accept the fact that universal credit has an expandable housing component where the tenant is in supported housing. We should also add, next slide please, that in order to claim supported housing rent, a provider of any legal identity must be accredited by the local authority like they were under supporting people. We still have those frameworks. Why can't we get them out, refresh them and use them? It wouldn't cost anything or very much. But having said that, let's look at the inquiry report and the regulatory oversight bill in a little bit, because there is a model of sorts that we need to explore around. It's not quite accreditation, but it's close. Continued accreditation under my system would depend on the outcomes of service oversight processes. In other words, what's the quality of what you do? New slide, please. Okay, so it's not about regulation. I keep banging on about this, and I've been banging on about this since before the exempt accommodation inquiry was a thing, because politicians locally and nationally and other big people within the supported housing sector keep going on about regulation, regulation, regulation. Well, it's not about regulation. It's about accreditation, and it's about oversight of what providers do. Accreditation of providers and oversight of what they do. I've made the point already that the debate has been skewed by misunderstandings, one of which is that exempt accommodation being a potentially dubious subset of supported housing, when in actual fact what it is an outdated revenue entitlement rule. And the other problematic assumption is that the problem with exempt accommodation is a lack of regulation, because actually we're chock full of regulators. New slide, please. So the regulator for social housing, the Charity Commission, the CIC regulator, the FCA for otherwise unregulated voluntary organisations. So we've got 4 regulators within the supported housing ecosystem. The problem is that none of them are expert in supported housing, especially, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, I include within that the regulator of social housing. None of them have a monopoly on supported housing providers either. They regulate their core business well enough. As I say in the slide, supported housing not so much, in my humble opinion. New slide, please. I made the point earlier on that I think it's actually about accreditation and oversight. Supported housing providers should be accredited or not, as the case may be, if they don't pass muster, by local authorities. If you don't get accreditation, you don't get funding, whether it's enhanced housing benefit or what I would call supported housing rent. Oversight should be conducted not by local authorities, of service quality I mean here, should not be conducted, in my opinion, by local authorities because they hold the purse strings. It should not be conducted by providers for obvious reasons. But a third-part independent organisation based on a university with social policy experience, for example, could operate a system based on what I call value generation principles, of which there are 3. What are the outcomes for people who live in supported housing, qualitatively measured? New slide, please. Because I mean, organisations like financial data, don't they? But if you say to somebody, how do you feel about your supported housing? They're not going to say 42. So how do we qualitatively record, how people feel about where they live? Secondly, what's the cost benefits of the public purse, which you clearly do measure quantitatively? Thirdly, wider social and community benefit. You measure it quantitatively because you can cost the number of saved criminal justice, healthcare, social care, homelessness interventions through the existence of a scheme, but you can also qualitatively get a feel for how the community feels about the presence of the place and what it's done. So I think that would make a good set of principles for an external oversight system. I think the exempt accommodation rules should be abolished. Just get rid of them, because what we're doing is we're trying to make something that doesn't work into a Heath Robinson diagram with what is proposed. It's the fundamental problem with the system is the exempt accommodation rules. Don't try and amend what flows from them, just get rid of them. It's actually not that straightforward. The other thing to get rid of is the housing benefit subsidy reclaim rules, which mean that the local authorities only can get their money back from the DWP if it's a registered provider that's the landlord. Why would that be necessary if we had the other parts of the system sorted out? It's not helped the system, as you can see in Birmingham. So I believe that the system I proposed around supported housing rent should be introduced as a replacement for the exempt accommodation rules, but that's just what I think. Next slide, please. Okay, so the exempt accommodation inquiry. The first link is a link to a blog post I wrote, or a briefing, I suppose, in response to the exempt accommodation inquiry report. And if I can just read it verbatim, there is a saying that hard cases make bad law, and I believe, unfortunately, this is what we're seeing here. With some exceptions, notably on domestic violence and abuse, the report is a missed opportunity based on an inadequate grasp of the supported housing ecosystem that it wants to reform, which is, I think, is what I have just said. The second link takes you to Commonweal Housing's online broadcasts of the Exempt, Experts on the Exempt series, which I really recommend you have a listen to stroke watch. The reason I put it there is that in putting together the regulatory oversight bill, Bob Blackman, its MP, its sponsor, described the exempt accommodation system as a Wild West gold rush, and that's a soundbite that I was responsible. Thanks very much, Bob Blackman. So anyway, I say that with a smile on my face. But have a look at that link. It's really an interesting range of views on exempt accommodation just before the inquiry reported. New slide, please. Okay, so focuses on regulation. The fact that it misunderstands the nature of the supported housing sector, the constant reference, for example, to the regulator of social housing, whereby the regulator does not regulate the entirety even of the social supported housing system, maybe 70% of it, maybe less than that, but not the totality. And what we're lacking in terms of focus here is the non-registered provider supported housing sector, because it doesn't, in my opinion, really get a look in. We'll carry on. Quite rightly, the exempt accommodation inquiry identifies the National Statement of Expectations for Supported Housing, which I guess you will have all seen, as an important document. There should be a bullet point here saying referral pathways into supported housing should be subject to LA approval, local authority approval. Absolutely they should. And in talking to local authorities with enhanced housing benefit claims and things like that these days, one of the first things they talk about is referral sources, and quite right too. Because we have a problem with the exempt accommodation industry, if I can call it that, with people importing need into areas by charging, by setting up supported housing and charging tenants allegedly very little, but taking vast amounts of HB from them. New slide, please. The inquiry report says that care support and supervision should be redefined. Well, if we're not going to get rid of exempt accommodation, we have to retain the notion of care support and supervision. It's one of the requirements of exempt accommodation. If we're going to retain it, yes, definitely do define it. We'll have to wait and see what that looks like in practice. The inquiry says that the government must devise a set of standards for local authorities to enforce relating to referrals, which I've just mentioned, the definition of care support and supervision, which I've just mentioned, housing quality, the information that is provided to supported housing residents as well. And what we'll see when we look at the regulatory oversight bill is provision for a system that reflects this. The inquiry report says local authorities should be given funding to do this. And as we'll see from the supported housing regulatory oversight bill, that is repeated for the systems, if not other things which I'll come on to. New slide, please. A good part of the inquiry report is the point that they make around domestic violence and abuse services, and what they're saying is refuge providers must meet the standards in Part 4 of the Domestic Abuse Act. And the reason they're saying that is, as I'm sure you're aware, we're seeing increasing examples where people fleeing domestic violence and abuse are being accommodated in buildings with people with whom it's really not appropriate for them to be there. It's not a refuge, it's sort of some form of supported housing, but it's not specialised domestic violence and abuse provision, and it will have to be, as far as the exempt accommodation inquiry report is. It also states that we should be setting up a national oversight committee, and this is a sort of a government advisory panel to address the oversight of supported housing providers, but not their services. This again is reflected in the bill. This committee should be comprised of existing regulators. The report describes as being expert in their own areas. Well, we'll see when we get to the regulatory oversight bill who those regulators are. New slide, please. So, one of the more troubling recommendations of the exempt accommodation inquiry report is that supported housing providers, sorry, let me correctly quote that, supported exempt accommodation providers should have to register as registered provider. All that correction of the terminology does is exclude private sector supported housing providers from having to register because they're not exempt accommodation because they're private. But the suggestion is if you are a supported housing provider, a non-profit supported housing provider, you have to register as a registered provider with the regulator for social housing, regulation of social housing. The regulator of social housing has been busy trying to swapped people away from doing so for years, because it's had its hand bitten by having perhaps registered organisations it probably shouldn't have done that were involved in supported housing. I don't know what the regulator's response was when it saw this, but it's going completely contrary to what the direction of travel that they, as a regulator, were going in terms of supported housing. And I don't think it's an appropriate thing to do at all, and I don't think it's possible. The report says that registration shouldn't be unnecessarily onerous or expensive, and if it is, it should change, and that's a direct quote. Well, you know, watch this space, because it is onerous at the moment. Not necessarily hugely expensive, unless you're a small charity, but quite a few of these solid housing providers are. It seems to me to be using a hammer to crack a nut, this. How it will work in an environment where the regulator currently does not encourage supported housing providers to register, and where most social supported housing providers, if not all, are already regulated by another body, and where the problem is not one of regulation. You could use the Exempt Accommodation project to get around this requirement to register, and that's something I set up in June of 2021, beg your pardon, which simply is a project that looks with the assistance of local authorities, to work with non-profit providers of supported housing who have their own property or lease their own property, to then lease it or sublease it to a specialist registered provider for a short period of time on a rolling basis. That would get around that particular problem. But if you're interested, click that link when you get a moment. So could we have the next slide, please? Another bit of a gobsmacker for me is that the report thinks the government should prohibit lease-based profit-making schemes from being set up. Well, as I mentioned before, hard cases make bad law. This is an archetypal example of a knee-jerk to an absolutely understandable situation where there are some appallingly bad leasehold arrangements that cream off a huge amount of money. But the problem is that the supported housing sector cannot do without private capital. What it needs to be thinking about is social impact investment capital, not hedge fund capital. Social impact investment capital, it takes LHA rates of return. That's it. The rest stays within the system as it should, but that's still a for-profit lease-based model, isn't it? So that is simply not a good idea. We need to be a bit discriminatory in terms of what private finance we deal with. We are supposed to be sorting the sheep out from the goats. We're not supposed to be chucking the baby out with the bathwater, which is what this would do.
Really interesting point, Michael, just from the chat there from Kenny Young. She said, thinking out loud, and it's a thought rather than a question, but I wonder if any of this has been considered or will be covered under the new Ofsted registration for supported accommodation for young people. Have you heard anything about that at all?
I must say I haven't, but what I do hope happens, and I'm no expert on services for young people, I was aware of the fact that of what they were doing. I just hope they do this in a coordinated fashion. I really do. So instead of looking at schemes for young people in this sense as being a separate thing, you know, if there's change afoot, well, how far can we integrate this change?
Brilliant, thank you.
No worries. Could we have a new slide, please? So another inquiry recommendation that local authorities should conduct a review of housing benefit claims to determine how much has been spent on what. It's not the first time they've been asked to do that, and I think there are problems with infrastructure in terms of management of claims, but I guess they've had a few years since to put in place systems to determine how much is being spent on what. We still don't know what the annual enhanced HV bill, the crisis report conservatively said 800 million, which is why I said around $1 billion, because it probably is, but you know, I don't know. The report says rent should be capped at a reasonable level. Well, you know, the only issue I have is with the word reasonable. But yes, if reasonable is the same as what I think it is, I agree. Rent should be capped at a reasonable level because it's a simple system, provided it covers the costs of the schemes, and we don't go down the route of a cost control approach in terms of deciding what's reasonable. Cost control, I mean, you know, lowest unit cost. Go back to what I said about an outcome system based on value generation. We should have the same sort of thinking about how much in terms of what supported housing does to deserve to be funded, what are the outcomes for people? What's the cost benefits for the public purse? What's the wider social community benefit? And cost control only does the middle one. We need all three of those principles. Next slide, please. I love this one. The report says funding for support should be provided separately. Certainly should, whatever support is these days. Doesn't say how. And since the demise of SP, as I'm sure you know, it hasn't really been funded since. And this is the sort of a big missing question from the whole of this discussion. Whilst the government says that local authorities rightly should have new burdens funding for the infrastructure they're going to propose. So there's anything about how you're going to fund support. Elephant in the room there, just spotted. Okay, increasing pressure, as you may well know, in recent months, in recent years actually, but since May last year in particular, new guidance from the DWP around the administration of housing benefit claims has very much, and the Allerdale case, which I'm not competent to go into, but it's a factor if you want to look it up, in terms of focusing far more on purely property-related matters being eligible for enhanced housing benefit, and the sort of touchy-feely stuff, not so much. If you haven't already seen it and you want a sort of a list of routinely eligible enhanced housing benefit tasks and functions in that context, please click that link. It will take you to my blog, to a blog post that I update as things change in terms of what's routinely eligible. New slide, please. Another slightly unfortunate recommendation: all supported housing, irrespective of the number of people living in a particular scheme, should be subject to HMO licensing, even if the landlord is a registered provider. That could be problematic. I did some work recently with a women's refuge that was told it had to conform to HMO standards, so it was looking prior to this for an RP to lease its property to, because if it didn't do so and it had to then put in place HMO changes to the buildings for HMO compliance purposes, it would become unviable because it would lose 2 rooms. And you can think of smaller supported housing schemes where this may well be an issue. However, as those of you who know Birmingham and other authorities may well know, there are selective licensing schemes in the offing, which may well replace that requirement. And again, when we look at the bill, there's a bit more to say about this. That selective licensing scheme, though, someone said to me, oh, it looks like supporting people too. I don't think it quite is, though it does give the local authority wide scope to come and see the whole totality of what happens, apart from the delivery of support. And one of the big differences is the provider will be paying for it per licence per scheme. So I don't know if you guys have got any numbers on what that is. I've heard things like £700 per licence. That's quite a lot of money. New slide, please. So, by way of summary on this bit, we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. The solution to the abuse of the exempt accommodation rules is to abolish them, introduce the organisational accreditation process to which supported housing providers were subject under supporting people, if you remember, and a service oversight process that's independent of both local authorities and providers, based on value generation principles, pay supported housing rent to accredited providers instead of enhanced housing benefit, which should be abolished along with the exempt accommodation rules. Simples, as they say on the insurance area.
There's been a comment that said that about £500 to £750 per licence. This was by Jay, depending on local authority, is what I've noticed. But it needs renewal every 3 to 5 years, again, depending on the local authority.
Yes, I mean, it's an interesting one. I don't want to sound cynical, but the funding burden has shifted to providers for this. Anyway, just an observation. Thanks for that figure. New slide, please. Okay, so regulatory oversight bill, second attempt to legislate on this. You may recall that a private member's bill came out 2 to 3 years ago. Barnum and Mood was involved in it, MP for Ladywood. It didn't get parliamentary time. Now, Bob Blackman then came along with another private member's bill recently in the context of the Exempt Accommodation Inquiry report, in the context of the Exempt Accommodation pilots, and therefore this is an awful lot better chance. It's got cross-party support. Reflects some of the recommendations of the inquiry report, not all of them. One of the things it does reflect is this preoccupation with regulation. It was Bob Blackman developed it, as I understand it, in conjunction with Crisis, who have, as you may know, a Regulate the Roads, that word again, Regulate the Roads campaign, the National Housing Federation and others, and I think the influence does show through. New slide, please. So, firstly, the creation of an advisory panel. Do you remember the inquiry report saying there should be this national committee that's being set up to advise the Secretary of State? And it will include certain interests, including registered providers, local housing authorities, social services and residents. So that's a national advisory panel that will advise the Secretary of State on matters relating to exempt accommodation, information advice on issues related to supported exempt accommodation, including anything the panel views that could have a significant impact on its provision or regulation. New slide, please. Local housing strategies. This is clause 2. There are basically 11 clauses. We've heard this one before, and quite rightly. Local housing authorities will be required to carry out a review of supported exempt accommodation in their districts and publish a supported housing strategy. Hopefully that supported housing strategy would take on board what is not its supported exempt accommodation, in other words, private sector supported housing. A supported housing strategy should include assessment of supply and demand, and other matters as may be specified going forward. I mean, this is formalising what the National Statement of Expectations has said already. Local authorities might understandably argue, well, we wouldn't do this, we haven't had any funding to do it. I think there will be new burdens funding to do this. It's certainly necessary that local authorities are able to manage their supported housing ecosystem. And you see this increasingly happening now with working with providers and local authorities. They're taking a more strategic view. It's not as a consequence of the bill, but it fits in with it. New slide, please. Sorry. Well, sorry, go back one. I've jumped ahead. If you can go back one, yeah, to clause 3. Is it clause 3? Yeah, so if you go, that's right, fine. So clause 3, national supported housing standards. Again, this was something that came out in the inquiry report, set of national standards. So the Secretary of State will be empowered to propose new supported housing standards for England. No, obviously this is not UK-wide, obviously. Minimum standards in respect of type, condition of premises used for provision of supported exempt accommodation, care, support and supervision. This, the inquiry report recommended standards, and it also recommended process by which those standards are enforced, which we'll look at in a minute if we can go to the next slide. And here we go, licensing. The Secretary of State will have power to make regulations requiring people managing supported exempt accommodation to obtain and comply with a licence issued by the relevant local authority. This is the selective licensing scheme, which we referred to earlier on, I guess. Clause 5 sets out the range of issues: enforcement, consequences of non-compliance, exemptions and fees, restrictions. I would have a good look at the actual wording of clause 5 of the bill as drafted, because it's basically it's an enforcement mechanism. New slide, please. Okay, so Secretary of State has to consult statutory consultees before exercising the power to make these licensing regulations. So who are these statutory consultees that we referred to back a few slides ago? The Local Government Association, which you would expect, local authorities are at the forefront of this, the National Housing Federation and the Regulator of Social Housing. I wouldn't say I wouldn't expect those two. I would say that that is double representation for only part of the sector, if I'm blunt. What about non-RSH regulated supported housing providers or exempt supported accommodation providers, of which there are very many? Now, I know the logic is that under the inquiry report, everyone has to register as a registered provider, but I don't see that happening. Anyway, so I think that's a shortcoming. New slide, please. This is just a an observation about the fact that local authorities, in terms of exercising their licensing functions, have to look at this national supported housing standards that are about to be drafted as a consequence of this bill, and any other guidance. So they have to operate in the context of that. New slide, please. Now this is another interesting one, planning. So when these licensing regulations are introduced, and I assume they would either be or replace the sort of selective licensing that Birmingham is looking at, they have to, the outcome of them, their effects have to be reviewed within 3 years. And on the basis of that, the Secretary of State will decide whether or not supported housing needs planning consent in certain circumstances. My understanding was it has to have a C3 use class classification anyway, but perhaps, I'm no planner, perhaps you don't have to get planning consent for that. But in any event, for those who understand planning, that's an observation. New slide, please. A good bit of the bill, though its enforceability is open to question, if someone has to leave what they call supported exempt accommodation as a consequence of poor conditions, lack of care, substandard, sub-national supported housing standard services, they will not be declared intentionally homeless. Clearly a good thing. Let's hope people don't have to do that stuff anyway. And we need to think about how would that actually be administered, I mean, in terms of local authorities saying, well, is that true? New slide, please. And then, without going through the detail of this, one of the things that the politicians are keen to do is to enable sharing of information at local and supra-local level, particularly in terms of things that are a cause for concern, so that there's shared information about poor practice. I think this is probably what this is about. New slide, please. And that's it. I hope that wasn't too much of a, what's the word, a brain dump, but
not at all. It was really useful, thank you. And I think there's a lot of information there, judging by, well, I mean, put it this way, the participants went up during it and didn't go down. So people have clearly stayed and paid attention, Michael, so that's excellent. Has anybody got any questions that they'd like to bring to the table, comments made on the presentation itself? Can I bring anyone else in to have a conversation? Because that was certainly enlightening for me.
No, stunned silence.
I'll have a go.
Yeah, please do, Wayne. Good to see you. I'll bring in Wayne, then Pauline, then Kenna.
How are you? You okay? Yes, obviously completely agree with what obviously Michael's saying in regards to your regulation. The sector is obviously full of regulation. The issues that we can foresee is obviously entry into support. Hence why obviously we've came up with Room Match. We've got a second part of our business coming out next month in regards to the digitalisation of support. When you look at obviously your regulatory oversight, in regards to the support elements that are being offered, generally we're running around about 2 months to 3 months in arrears. The only way the sector is going to change really is live and true information. So yeah, that's where we're pretty much pushing for next month.
Really good to hear. Michael, thoughts?
Well, I mean, I suppose the main point that you were making, Wayne, forgive me if I'm wrong, is access to real-time information around standards, around oversight. One of the things that I've been very, very anxious to develop is the discussion around oversight of services, because, you know, government and the sector establishment, if I can call it that, talks about regulation a lot. Within the language of both the inquiry report and the bill, they talked about regulatory oversight. So it's a sort of slight move in terms of language, but not really in terms of focus, because the oversight is still of organisations and their structures, not on the nature of the services they deliver, and that's hugely important. And it would be really nice to see a standardised cloud-based system that makes that work.
Yeah, so I mean, what we've pretty much developed at the moment, I say it's been a long time in the making. So entry into support from literally from a telephone call now, and I can go into this in a lot more detail at a later date, literally from a telephone call to entry into support to referral form to sector need, age brackets on obviously individuals to a move-in date, using obviously a live dated CRM system straight away through then to hopefully move out to independent living. So yeah, it's been a long time in the making, but next month obviously we can go into a lot more detail.
I'll look forward to hearing from that one. Pauline, I'm going to bring you in.
Firstly, my apologies, colleagues. I had IT gremlins this morning, even to get into Teams. So, and I think I got the tail end of the presentation. I think for me, for Adullam, and I've only recently just started here and being in Birmingham under the quality standard regime, I just wanted to know from colleagues who may practice in Birmingham as well, and maybe on a quicker journey because they signed up to Spring and the Charter, what their stage has been in terms of some of the things that we've mentioned under the standards and what the government is seeking, because we've had exempt accommodation inspectors email us regarding tenants who, rightly so, through the website have reached out because of concerns that they may have had with ASB, or how as a provider we've dealt with that. And I just wanted to know, I left the sector back in 2019 and went to general needs, and at that time in Birmingham they were bringing in this gold, silver, bronze process of if you signed up to these standards by Birmingham Voluntary Sector Council. So it's a two-thing approach really, is where are we now as a sector in Birmingham, me coming back as a practitioner into support, that it would be useful to find out from other colleagues who may be practicing in Birmingham. And how does that reality check against Birmingham and a local authority based on what Michael has mentioned are some of those clauses that they're going to be doing things about? Particularly the one for me was the public supported housing strategy and whether that's released or a date. Thank you. More questions than answers, I'm afraid.
I think that's the nature of the sector at the moment. Michael, any thoughts on that? Has anybody else got a comment they'd like to make on Pauline's point before I bring in Kenna? But Michael, over to you first.
Well, I think that goes, I mean, Pauline was talking very much about focus on practitioners in Birmingham, of which I'm not one, and I think the experts are in the room rather than sitting where I am on that one. So, I mean, what I did think as Pauline was talking was that actually that would make for, you've got a WhatsApp group, haven't you? And presumably a chat channel here as well, because what Pauline's basically asking for, correct me if I'm wrong, Pauline, is interaction and information from people who are in the same position as she is. Is that right?
Yeah, very, very much so. I mean, Sarah Davis has put there, isn't the point of licensing so that oversight is at service and local level? So an interesting point made there. Definitely, I think if anybody wants to kind of reach out to Pauline, please do. As I say, as Eden's already mentioned as well, there is a WhatsApp group. So if anyone is looking to join that, then ping your number over to Eden, and she'll put in that, and she's actually just put that one on the chat as well. So we're obviously on the same page there. I'm going to move on to Kenna. Kenna, over to you.
Maybe sort of slightly off topic, and again, mine's more thought. I'm thinking out loud as we're sort of chatting about things.
That's all good.
We, we're predominantly in the south and kind of Hampshire and the surrounding areas, but we cover a lot of districts and boroughs. So our interactions with housing, there's a lot of housing benefits departments that we engage with, and we're certainly seeing, and I think you touched on it, but Michael, we're seeing that they are being a lot more rigorous in terms of what they will pay for, and questioning us as to what we're defining as support. So something we're now having to really think about when we are looking at potential new contracts is that commitment that we've got from the commissioners and those that are in those services, housing benefit, housing, whatever, at what support they're able to give us, because in some areas we've had real challenges, and the level of detail that we're being expected to provide in terms of support plans, outcome stuff, that they're wanting that kind of granular level of detail. So we're obviously trying to work on those relationships, but we're really having to think about trying to get that in conversation before we even take on contracts, to make sure services are viable for us, and we're not going to have significant delays in getting housing benefit, which we've had in some areas.
Yeah, I mean, that reflects the position nationally, doesn't it, really, the increased focus on HB. Have you been, out of interest, asked to complete SEA forms, the supported exempt accommodation applications for the new schemes?
No, we haven't been asked explicitly to complete those, so I don't know if that's being done, if they're doing that themselves with the information we're providing.
they make you do it. I mean, the reason I make the observation is because I suspect that some of you, or a lot of you here, will have come across exempt accommodation applications, SEA forms, which have to be completed now for new providers, for new schemes, for new lands, and everything else. And they're all being done very differently. I've probably got about a dozen of them on my desk, and they go from 3 pages in Leeds to 15 in Birmingham. 15 might be a bit short, but one of the good things about those is sharing of information, both about the questions in the SEA forms and what people put in them. Because whilst we've got an inconsistent position, every local authority has a different approach, and that needs to change. Sharing of information together for forms like this on perhaps rather boring, but actually really important things like SEA forms and how you do them is really important, because they are designed to trip you up. You know, in the same thing as you're experiencing in Hampshire over additional scrutiny.
And Kenna, actually, there's a question there from Eden. Do you provide support also, or is there a separate support provider?
So we're the support provider. So some of the times we're the accommodation and support provider, but we provide that support.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Victoria, I'm going to bring you in.
Hi, thanks. I'm Vicky. I'm Head of Public Affairs and Policy at HFT. Thanks, Michael, for your presentation. It was brilliant and really, really informative. I've got a question really about the bill, and welcome thoughts from anybody. But I know that one of our concerns was that with the issuing of licences from local authorities, as an organisation that works across the country with lots and lots of local authorities, if each has stipulations in order to provide a licence which is slightly different, that would obviously mean a huge amount of work for us, additional resource, additional time. And I understand under clause 4, local housing authorities will have to operate in light of the national supporting housing standards also set by the bill. But will that be mandatory? Will that be kind of equal and the same across the board? I understand there's obviously kind of a push and pull between something which is set nationally, but also having to adhere to local needs. But it would be interesting to hear other people's thoughts about that, and how the bill, I don't know, perhaps could be amended to mean that it doesn't have to be such an onerous process for those who are looking for licences across different local authorities.
I think that lack of consistency is absolutely one of the biggest issues, I think, in the sector as a whole at the moment, isn't it, Michael? It
is. I absolutely echo Victoria's concerns about that. We need a national framework, but not just for licensing. I think Pauline referred earlier on to the BBSC, the local quality standards, and it's good that we go in the direction of improving quality, but I struggle with the fact that if we've got different quality standards in different local authority areas, the problems that Victoria's outlined are going to be replicated there as well. So I'm all in favour of a national set of standards that are implemented consistently at local level. So if you are a provider and you work in 2 local authorities, you can have, without sounding like I'm trying to diminish the importance of you can have a template approach for each local authority area, albeit that there are going to be slight variations. For example, one local authority won't want you to develop in a particular area because there's too much social stress, and so on. But let's have
Can you see there being that coming because of the bill, though? Do you think that something like that will be added to it, so that it will be taken as a more kind of, this is now the national expectation, or do you think that's a future, I guess, policy that might come in further down the line?
Well, I think the bill is actually hinting at that, isn't it, when it talks about national frameworks. So what I hope will happen is that's what we see is a national framework. It's for me, I don't think we're quite going in the right direction in terms of the inquiry and the bill. I mean, there are certain things that are really good, certain things I've got a real problem with, but where there is the scope for improvement, and there is the scope for improvement, let's see it as a national approach, an England-wide approach.
Fingers crossed, absolutely. John Verge, good to have you with us. I'll bring you in. Thanks for that, Vicky.
Thanks, Matt. Just answering Vicky's question, actually, just to give you a reassurance, because I've been involved probably since August behind the scenes with NatFed and NHF with crisis around the bill, because there was, you can imagine the very first early versions were different to the bill as being presented, both at the second reading and more recently at the committee stage scrutiny. And I met Bob Blackman last Tuesday evening, and he did reassure a number of us on the call, many of whom are national providers like Golden Lane Housing, that for the licensing there would be a standard that all local authorities would have to meet. Now, they will be given some flexibility around how they introduce their licensing. Now, interestingly, Michael, I think you rightly picked up that the confusion that I think has been caused by the fact that this bill is a private member's bill, and the fact that DLUC are trying to make it into something that they would prefer to see going forward. And that's why the definition, whilst it refers to exactly the same wording as in the housing benefit regulations, it doesn't make any reference to housing benefit in the bill. And there's a reason for that, is because DLUC officials and the minister wanted to encompass the whole of supported housing within the bill, not just a very distinct, narrow definition through, as you rightly said, Michael, that the housing benefit regulations, which isn't a description of actually what supported housing is. So when it comes to the licensing, initially it will only be for those that meet currently the Category 1 definition. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you're receiving housing benefit through that exempt rules at the moment. It basically means if you're a provider of housing and also provide the support, you meet that definition under those rules. So when I've spoken recently to DLUC officials, what they've said is basically this bill is for any tenant living in supported housing where they receive their rent through housing benefit and not universal credit. So we know that pretty much, as Michael you alluded to earlier, is pretty much the whole of supported housing. So I think if you are a provider of non-commissioned short-term accommodation, I think that's at the moment where the licensing is really aimed for. Bob assured me that it wasn't intended for long-term commission services, like, for example, the services we provide for people with learning disabilities. But I think DLUC officials have been doing their best to deal with what was originally laid down in terms of the title back in June, and then subsequently what Bob and Crisis wanted to put forward. But so I think I've got no concerns at the moment, other than the planning rule, which fortunately they've reined back on, and it's only for the Secretary of State to consider in the future, rather than it being part of the bill from day one. But I think good providers shouldn't have any concerns. But I agree with you, Michael, that kind of the bill has started from the wrong point in the first place. But we are where we are with it.
Thank you, John. Go on, Michael.
No, I was just saying that's really interesting. It's really interesting. I mean, the one bit that gets missed out of the equation is, of course, the private sector supported housing. And if you look at the Birmingham situation, quite a lot of those private sector, particularly the mental health side, private sector supported housing providers are commissioned services. And I think, I don't know what percentage across England that sort of organisation constitutes as a percentage of the whole of the supported housing ecosystem. It's kind of been missed out. I suppose it's because it's not supported exempt accommodation, because it can't be exempt accommodation, it's private. It's been missed out, and I think that's one of the problems I have with that, is we have an opportunity to, in terms of standards, in terms of funding, in terms of accreditation and oversight, we've got the opportunity to bring them in. And
well, it's an interesting what you say, because the current bill doesn't include any private supported housing providers. They won't be included within this regulation.
Indeed, and I think that's the problem. If you looking at supported housing on a wider context, that's an important part of the sector. Its tenants should not be restricted to LHA simply because of the legal identity of their landlord. You've got services being commissioned, really high-end services. Some of the private sector providers doing a good job. Having generalised, I should say, I don't want to generalise, but that's my experience in Birmingham and elsewhere. And it would be useful. It would be interesting to see how they would be accommodated within a national framework of this nature.
I can see a comment there. Just a final point, because it's 11 o'clock and a few people are having to go. So Sue Weston had put is calling for national regulation to go slightly against the current trend towards localism. And definitely a thought again to kind of leave with, i.e. the current planning consultation which abolishes national targets. Thank you, everybody who could come today. Yes, Pauline, the has been recorded, so we can get that shared afterwards. A big thank you to Michael and to Eden for obviously helping put everything together. And as you say, if you are looking to join the WhatsApp group, just reach out to her. And to Michael for showing such an insight there, I think, into the regulation bill, where it is at the moment, and I guess what might be happening next. Eden, when's our next meeting?
So the next meeting would be Thursday, the 30th of March at 10 o'clock. So I'll send that off to those already on our mailing list. And obviously, if anybody else would want to attend, please just email me or message me on LinkedIn or Twitter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Do get in touch with me if you'd like to get involved with any of the roundtable information as well. But for now, thank you, everybody, and have a great week. Cheers.
Bye.
Thanks, bye.